What's she doing here?
Dunno, Velgarth shrugged. Sightseeing. Sightseeing? We're about to fight a war here.
Aldan curled his lip at the sheer ludicrousness of the human. Even now, she was examining the corner of a nearby building as if it was the most interesting thing in the world. Under a canopy formed out of Death Knight shields with a bug at her side and a bird on her head. The histories portrayed human culture as the peak of decadence and depravity, and it seemed that they weren't far from the truth. "Sir," an officer offered him a salute as he came forward, "landings have begun in the designated area." "Did we make a convincing withdrawal?" Aldan asked. "The enemy appears to be invested," the officer answered. "Their airdrop troops have created a loose cordon and now they're teleporting their teleporters. Scouts estimate that they've cycled through several hundred already." He clicked his tongue in vexation. The gazers that they were fighting weren't some random hive that one might find anywhere in the Middle Realms. The problem with fighting non-humanoid races, heteromorphs and monsters especially, was not merely the fact that they tended to be vastly superior to everything else in a physical sense, but also the fact that they could develop a wide range of racial skills and spell-like abilities which could make them distinctly different from others of the same kind. Teleportation was a 5th-tier spell, but it was unlikely that the Gazer Hive had hundreds of 5th-tier casters. Instead, they probably had a branch of Gazers that specialized in the rapid deployment of troops, developing teleportation as a spell-like ability. This, in turn, made it necessary to consider what else the Hive had at its disposal, and what they already had without any of that was annoying enough. "Is that teleportation replacing an eye power or is it something else?" Aldan asked. "It looks like an eye power," the officer answered. "The transporters zap themselves and vanish once they familiarize themselves with the landing zone. Reinforcements pop up one at a time." "Great. If it was an eye power, then it would be something they could do almost non-stop. However, it was unlike regular teleportation, which could transport groups of people. The nature of the realms below also limited its usefulness, but it was a powerful tool in areas with large, unobstructed spaces like the chasms that divided the principalities of Karsanar. "What are they using to secure their landing zone?" "They're saturating the area with goblins, mostly. It's taking some time for them to approach the new perimeter." That was a good sign, at least. If they were being so cautious without meeting resistance, their advance would grind to a halt once they did. After several days of absolute vigilance against their enemy's reconnaissance efforts, the second that Aldan's battalion covered was instructed to feign combat fatigue and supply issues to lure the Gazer forces to focus on an area of the Dark Dwarves' choice. An encirclement of the incursion area had been drawn, one of many concentric defensive lines meant to contain the growing invasion force in the designated battle area. By all appearances, it would be a massive death trap for the invading forces, but they hadn't figured out the full capabilities of those forces yet. "There any way for us to bring the Death Knights into play without scaring our enemies all the way back to their insertion point?" "I don't think so, sir. The best plan still seems to be the one that our rentals came up with." As expected of the undead, a cold, no-nonsense proposal had been made by the Elder Lich Sergeants as a containment strategy. The operational perimeter was divided into blocks where their enemy would be cordoned off and reprocessed into zombies and wights once suitable numbers filled the area. Aldan questioned whether they were capable of such precise maneuvering on foreign territory, but the strategy had apparently been enacted elsewhere and they were confident that they could pull it off. At this stage of the battle, he couldn't imagine any catastrophic failures. It was Death Knights fighting untrained battle fodder, after all, so he approved of the proposal. Clan Feelhammer had lost nearly all of its battle thralls, and padding it with expendable undead was better than nothing. "Are we having any problems funneling the Gazer forces in the right direction?" "Not that I've heard," the officer replied. "We have companies of Deep Wardens nipping at their flanks, so the Gazers should be focused on defending against our attempts to retake their foothold and exploiting their breakthrough." Gazers, at least the big ones, were highly intelligent and suspicious, so it wouldn't be until the real fighting started that Aldan would gain some sense of what they were up to. This was especially the case in the opening moves of a battle where expendable forces were being deployed. Battle fodder could be sent to their deaths for no specific reason other than to confuse the enemy and fill their commanders' heads with useless information. "Block 2 is nearing ideal density," the Elder Lich Sergeant and his escort said. "Are our forces in position?" Aldan asked. "They are," the Elder Lich answered. "However, We are uncertain if they will remain concealed for long. Let's get over there and see what happens, then. Stand by for my order to proceed. Deepingstone, are your observers in place? Aye, they are. The dwarf that responded was not Lord Diurga Deepingstone, but a veteran Deep Warden named Kaiden, one of the dwarf lord's nieces serving as an officer in Uldan's battalion. Fortunately, she didn't share the more obnoxious physical and behavioral characteristics of her uncle. One of the nearby grey robes cast flight magic on them and they went from their rooftop command platform to a building with a decent vantage over Blocker 2. Along the way, he eyed the wall of explosions in the air that stretched all along the borders of Fjellhammer. The intensity of the defensive barrage seemed to have lessened somewhat, which was a good thing considering their limited supplies of ammunition. Even after seizing everything that the council had brought with them, they couldn't keep it up for much more than a few days. They alighted on a 10-story tall slave dormitory near the center of the designated block. Unlike the defense of Fjellhammer against the council, the dark lamps lining the streets were left active to help spot their flying foes. Groups of goblins advanced cautiously, stopping every so often to examine rubbish bins and check locked doors. Stone clubs, slings and loincloths, eh? I guess they'll be receiving an upgrade once the undead get to them. It was a satisfying notion. Enemy fodder with next to worthless combat potential could be turned into much stronger wights, which were then turned against their former masters. Let's begin, Uldan said. In the street across from their vantage, a goblin walked up and checked a closed door. To the goblin's surprise, the door opened. The other goblins nearby came forward curiously. Then, a dwarf jumped out of the darkness, bowling over the first goblin. High-pitched goblin screeches rose into the air as more dwarves flooded out of the buildings, clawing and biting at any goblin that they could reach. Uldan peered down at the wights. Their armor wasn't the black steel plate of Karsanar. Instead, they were adorned in suits of dull grey scale. They had supposedly been picked up by the first batch of elder liches on their way through the ruined hill dwarf country under the Abelian hills. Ah, Velgarth said, they broke. He wasn't sure if there was any resistance in the first place. Most of the goblins had thrown their clubs at the nearest wight and ran straight in the opposite direction. I don't know what you expected, Uldan said. Not that running will help them any. The panicked goblins stampeded up the street and into a line of death knights blocking off the next intersection. With thousands of their fellows behind them, the goblins in the front were helplessly pushed forward. Dark blood quickly formed a stream in the gutter as the invaders were skewered by glowing black blades 2 and 3 at a time. By the time the crowd's momentum finally reversed, half of them were zombies chasing them along. The chase didn't last very long as a wall of wights trapped the goblins in the street, leaving them to choose between becoming a zombie or a wight. Not bad. Uldan nodded at the results. He and his officers barely had to do anything. Then a frown formed behind his beard as a sniff sounded from nearby. Hey, Velgarth, he said. Your human's crying. She's not my human, his sister replied. You're supposed to attend to her, yeah? Velgarth flounced off with a disgusted sound. Uldan furrowed his brow. He couldn't recall her flouncing off before. The human was probably a bad influence. Hopefully, Velgarth wouldn't start dressing like a shrieker and crying every time a stupid goblin died. Have you decided how you wish to deploy the newly acquired assets? The Elder Lich asked. We'll go with the original plan for now, Uldan said. Pull the new undead back and position the wraiths on the fallback line. Let's see how long we can play this game for. It was too early to say what the Gazers would do, but, since they were opening the war by using expendable troops, Clan Fjellhammer might be able to string the conflict along for several days. In that time, they would be able to process hundreds of thousands, if not millions of the Gazers' forces into undead. Shortly after the sounds of slaughter abated, the Deep Wardens stationed to observe the battle came over to deliver their reports. That was an absolute slaughter, one of them said. It was harder to track down and kill the ones beyond the fringes of the cordon than anything else. How many got away? Uldan asked. I don't think we can give you a number, sir, the Deep Warden answered. If they're anything like our battle thralls, fleeing a battle will result in harsh punishment, so they won't report in to avoid that. We've sent a few people to see what happens. The Gazers likely had some sense that undead were being employed in the battle, but not the scale. Only the Elder Liches were being used in aerial defense, and it was mostly through flying summons to provide improved detection and interception of incoming scouts. Was there any sense of organization beyond clumping together for safety? Nothing beyond being sent in our direction. If there are any Gazer directors present, they're way in the back. How well have you been able to suppress their scouts? A few blocks out, sir, Kaiden told him. Since things went so nicely here, should I call for more scout companies? Do it, Aldan nodded. We'll repeat this along the front a few more times before pulling back. From now on, report back to me the moment you see signs of a commander taking to the field. The Deep Wardens dispersed. As things stood, the Gazers were fighting blind, playing a numbers game against their foes. Anyone doing so wouldn't expect immediate results. Letting them realize slow gains would keep them committed to their strategy. Things wouldn't change until they were convinced that it was time to commit more valuable forces, or if a commander came over to see what was going on for themselves. This one has a question, the Elder Lich Sergeant said. What? The current order of battle is similar to that of the previous conflict. What is the rationale behind it? Is an Elder Lich really asking me that? Elder Liches were well known for employing armies of weak undead against those who would invade their lairs. It was arguably more effective than using the living, as the undead did not tire or waver and often came with special qualities that lent well to wearing down the living. Our studies thus far indicate that it is an unsustainable practice for the living, the Elder Lich replied. It can be a situational strategy, Aldan admitted, but the powers of the realms below invariably arrive at that situation. Life is plentiful and cheap, and there's always more of it. Keeping things manageable has always been a necessity down here, and constantly culling the surrounding populations is a part of that. Using one part of the population to obliterate the other is one of the most efficient ways to do so. He still couldn't believe that certain principalities had grown so lax in their territorial vigilance that an army of millions had grown under them in a handful of decades. The Holdfast faction always tended to turn their gazes inward, but keeping problematic populations on the frontier in check should have been common sense. They were serious enough when it came to preparing for the incoming invasion, so perhaps there was something that everyone had missed. Can the same be assumed of our opponents? The Elder Lich asked. Gazers are highly intelligent, Aldan answered, but they're also ego-driven. If we put on a convincing show that feeds their sense of superiority, they won't give the loss of war assets a second thought. Or even a first thought. They'll assume that everything is going according to plan against an inferior enemy. Surely they should eventually realize that reality is not falling in line with their expectations? They will, Aldan replied, and that'll be the funniest part. Gazers are so full of themselves that they can't accept an inferior race besting them. Therefore, they'll rationalize that we're working for a rival Gazer hive that they were previously unaware of. The Elder Lich stared at him for a good long moment before returning to its duties. He couldn't blame it for its skeptical reaction. After watching 3 more battles play out in different tactical blocks and noting no changes, Aldan returned to his command post to organize an irregular, but steady withdrawal to their fallback line. Kaiden reported to him not long after he had relocated to the new position. Everything seems to be going smoothly, sir, she said. Scouts near the landing zone report that enemy reinforcements are coming in at an increased rate. At the same time, we're getting fewer probing attacks along the chasm, or at least the light show is slowing down. Then that means we should expect increased enemy reconnaissance here, Aldan stroked his beard in thought. Have those additional scout companies arrived yet? They have, sir. They're in the process of deploying around the perimeter now. If all that garbage that's been flying at us for the past few days is headed in our direction, though, it's not going to be enough. Has a runner been sent to General Korax with this information? Actually, send one from us anyway with a request for everything he can spare. This first bit is going to be rough until we adjust for it. Kaiden turned and spoke to 2 runners on standby, who leapt along the rooftops to deliver their message. Aldan examined their surroundings, his gaze stopping when it fell upon their human guest. Relocate to the floor below, he told his officers. Velgarth, can that human survive up here? His sister looked at the human, who only returned a blank look. Aldan sighed and scratched his head. You should get below too, just in case, he told her. Well, never mind them not recognizing you as an incompetent, the Gazers may just abduct you on sight. Abduct me? The human looked up worriedly. Why? Gazers enjoy visually stimulating things, Aldan replied. Your appearance will have them swarming around you in no time. It would help immensely if you covered that outfit of yours. The human fished out a dark grey mantle from her magical container, throwing it over her shoulders before descending to the top floor of their building. Aldan and his staff joined her at the row of windows facing the front lines. How long will the fighting last? The human asked. Until we completely deplete their forces, ideally, Aldan answered. Realistically, they'll notice something isn't right after a few days. But each battle just now killed over 10,000 people, the human's voice trembled. If this goes on for days, we'll kill millions. That's the point. I hear that the realms above are pretty sparsely populated, so you're probably not accustomed to those sorts of numbers being thrown around. This is normal here, however. Is there no peaceful solution? The powerful East Undead forces were kept out of sight with the goal of having their enemies believe that the summons were simply those of dwarf clerics rather than elder liches. The gazers would eventually realize what they were up against more than just dwarves, and that would probably happen not long after their watchers, a lesser type of gazer employed as scouts, were sent swarming over to support the advance of their slave armies. Even then, they probably wouldn't understand the full extent of what was going on for a while after that. This was thinking on a tactically and strategically conventional level, of course. Just as the gazers had few clues about what they were fighting, the same applied to Clan Feelhammer. There were bound to be more than a few nasty surprises in store. The enemy forces in Block B3 have been processed, the Elder Lich Sergeant informed him. Newly acquired assets are being deployed to the second fallback line. What about B7? Block B7 is at 85% completion. Has the composition of their forces changed any? No notable differences have been observed. Are things going too smoothly? No, it takes a long time to change anything in a battle of this scale. I should probably give things a poke, just in case. Turn the whites heading for Block C3 around, Aldan said. We're going to send them at Block A3 instead. Deepingstone, have your scout companies observe the enemy's reaction. Also, use the chaos to take a look at their forces deeper in. Yes, sir. How should the whites be deployed? The Elder Lich asked. There are no particular goals other than to bait out a reaction and potentially reveal enemy commanders, so keep them going for as long as possible. That white ball thing you mentioned before should do. Understood. The buildings in the area that they were fighting in were shallow due to the presence of a farm beneath them. They could only fall back a few more times before the terrain below them changed, meaning that the bulk of their defense would consist of a bloody back and forth in front of that area. We have consolidated the newly acquired whites in Block B3, the Elder Lich informed him. All right, Aldan nodded, let's see how much damage they can do. A minute or so later, the telltale sound of panicking goblins drifted through the windows. Aldan crossed his arms and leaned against a wall as he waited for the reports to start coming in. No notable resistance has been encountered, the Elder Lich said. Deployed white strength has increased by 5%. The screeches drifted further away. Deployed white strength has increased by 15%. Block B2, B5 and B9 have reached an ideal density. Go ahead and clean them up. What happened with B3? Processing in Block B3 is now complete. Deployed white strength in Block A3 has increased by 30%. Aldan uncrossed his arms and straightened from the wall. Are those compounding percentages? The figures are relative to the original deployed strength, the Elder Lich replied. Deployed white strength has increased by 50%. Maybe we should stop, Velgarth said. Pull half of those whites back to Block C3, Aldan ordered. The tactic was far more effective than he had anticipated, though it should have been expected against an untrained goblin mob. Deployed white strength has increased by 60%. How far have they advanced? Aldan asked. The offensive is halfway up the main thoroughfare in Block A3. We appear to have struck a logistical artery. And now we're gushing whites. Pull the remaining forces in Block A3 to Block B3. We'll have them hold that position against the next enemy advance. Long after he issued his order, the sounds of battle continued. Aldan looked over at the Elder Lich Sergeant. Did the enemy counterattack? No. All dominated forces have withdrawn as ordered. We believe that the activity stems from rogue whites. Rogue whites? Indeed. A small number of dominated whites was destroyed in the advance and their spawn are roaming free. Our elder liches are not in range to gain control over them, though the numbers are now too great to control with the available elder liches in the area.
Uh-oh.
Aldan turned to address the runners at the back of the room. Send word to the commanders maintaining the flanks of the perimeter, he told them. Let them know we have a runaway white situation.
How are we to determine enemy from ally?
One of the runners asked.
We don't, Aldan replied.
Assume that any white that comes within 100 meters of the perimeter is an enemy and destroy them.
The runners voiced their affirmatives before leaving the room.
Aldan turned back around to frown out of the window as the distant sounds of battle continued to increase in intensity.
Looks like we'll have to wait for this fire to burn itself out, he muttered.
2 days later,
the fighting continued to rage on.
Inside his temporary turned somewhat permanent command post, Aldan wondered how much longer it would take for the Gazers to reconsider their approach.
They're probably more offended than frustrated.
Are commanders even needed at this point? He grumbled.
The officers nearby only grunted wordlessly in response.
One of them yawned widely. Aside from the scout companies, there was nothing for anyone to do. Even the elder liches stood idly by. What began as an experimental attack with some whites had turned into a full-blown war of its own. Their enemies spent the last 2 days not fighting Clan Feelhammer, but the loose whites running all over the containment area. The expected swarm of Watchers similarly stopped well before Clan Feelhammer's lines to attack the undead. Watchers were uniquely ill-suited to fighting the whites. The small Gazers had 4 eye stalks, each possessing a different power. One produced a fear effect, another dazed their target, while the other 2 produced a ray of frost and a minor telekinetic effect similar to Mage Hand. As undead, whites were immune to mind-affecting spells and abilities, meaning that they were immune to being feared or dazed. They were also immune to cold damage, making the Watcher's primary form of ranged attack useless. The final power didn't cause any damage and was only able to influence unattended objects weighing under 2 kilograms. As a result, the Watchers had to fight in melee using bite attacks, which resulted in hilariously catastrophic losses. Physically speaking, they weren't much stronger than the goblins that came before them, so the whites overwhelmed them as well. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how one looked at it, whites could only turn humanoids or demi-humans, so there weren't any Watcher whites flying around. Clan Feelhammer had also destroyed more undead than they had Gazer forces, as the newly leased Elder Liches had long reached their domination limit from picking up loose whites within the first few hours of the battle. Unlike the Gazer forces, they had no problems dealing with the whites attacking the perimeter and suffered next to no casualties. Between the attrition that they suffered and replenishment from the battle fodder being thrown at them, the white forces plateaued around 100,000 by the middle of the first day and stayed fairly constant since then. For the most part, they acted like a chaotic, albeit more suicidal than usual, goblin mob. This in turn made it seem like Clan Feelhammer was just using their battle thralls against the Gazers' slaves, and the Gazers refused to back down out of a sense of stubborn pride. The millions of deaths that he had predicted for the battle were indeed happening, though they weren't adding to the strength of Clan Feelhammer's forces as planned. It was simply a fire that the Gazers kept throwing fuel at. Even the Death Knight seemed to be looking on in disgust. In hindsight, it was an obvious outcome. If one had tireless, single-minded soldiers with the combat potential of a middling battle thrall that turned what it killed into more of itself, feeding it an endless stream of worthless battle fodder very quickly resulted in an obnoxious self-propagating army.
We've brought lunch.
A sickeningly sweet voice issued from the entrance of the room, accompanied by an equally disgusting smile as the human woman walked in. Behind her, a pair of Death Knights brought in a couple of crates of bread. Well, aren't you a bright ray of sunshine? I hope you realize that dark dwarves are dayblind. It was the 4th such delivery over the last 2 days. Once it was evident that Clan Feelhammer wouldn't be doing all that much fighting, the human wandered off to observe the front. By dinner time, her activities had transformed into delivering provisions and goodwill to Clan Feelhammer's troops. Clan Feelhammer's troops took the food and shrugged off the goodwill. His sister continued to attend to the human, looking thoroughly miserable in the process. At least she wasn't being forced to wear a dress yet. "How is everyone doing?" the human asked. No one replied. Eventually, the human's expectant gaze settled on Aldan. "Nothing's changed aside from the death count," he told her. The human continued smiling, though he was certain that her enthusiasm had been knocked down a peg or two by his statement. Since there's been no change for over a day, Velgarth said, the Citadel's enacting a few of their own. Yeah? Turned away from his window, what's that? The thrall herds want to get back to work, so the refinery's active again. They're processing the slaves captured from our fight with the council. Will that go so smoothly? It shouldn't be a problem with former battle thralls, Velgarth said. They're still figuring out what to do with the captured dwarves. The answer should be obvious, Aldan snorted. Slit their throats and feed them to the slaves. Velgarth came over to join him at the window. Past her shoulder, Aldan could see the human handing out bricks of bread with the same stupid smile on her face. They already settled on that part, Velgarth said. It's just the order of things they're debating over. What's there to debate? Aldan asked. Well, most of the lords want them all butchered as soon as possible to prevent complications and free up logistics. That makes sense, Aldan said. What's the opposing stance? A few of the lords suggested that they only kill the men. That makes sense, too. There wouldn't be a debate if it didn't. He had a feeling that the second proposal would win out. They had to repopulate the realm, after all. Killing off the men and using the captive women as breeders was ultimately more pragmatic than disposing of all of their newly acquired assets. Who championed that argument? Aldan asked. Father did, Velgarth answered. Speaking of which, did you know that he tried to get that Elagar for you? Elagar, oh, you mean the Gloom Granite General? Yeah. How did that go? It didn't. She refused, so she died. I figured, Aldan said. Too much pride, that one. She rose too far, too fast. Over the past decade, Elagar Gloomgranite had gained a fair bit of fame and became known throughout the realm as one of Khazanar's top commanders, if not the top commander. With how powerful the undead forces are, Aldan said, he should have tried to capture her anyway. She would have made a fine addition to Clan Feelhammer even if she was unwilling to cooperate. Maybe, Velgarth replied in dubious tones. Someone as resourceful as her could probably cause all sorts of problems even as a captive. He was sure that was the case, but Elagar would have probably changed her tune once she realized that the rest of Khazanar was doomed. That aside, dwarf women always incorporated smoothly into their new clans once they started having children. The Citadel have anything else in the works? Harda's just about clear, Velgarth replied. New council reinforcements stopped showing up sometime yesterday. Did they receive a recall order or did the gazers hit them from behind? Too soon to tell, Velgarth replied. Either way, we'll have an army going on the offensive through there if only to make sure those passages are secured. What about us? It's not as if you have a bridge that you can cross, Velgarth shrugged. The forces defending Feelhammer are probably stuck where they are until the forces attacking through Harda find out which principality those passages lead to and secure a port there. The door to the room opened again and Kaiden walked in. The gazers are losing, she said. Aldan snorted. You mean the gazers' slaves? Yeah, Kaiden said. Do gazers get eye strain? We've lost count of how many troops they've teleported across the chasm. Have they brought in anything new? 3 directors. I watched one of them eat a few watchers the moment it arrived. Finally, Aldan said. What did they bring with them? A half-dozen standards and a cohort of stronger slaves. Ogres, trolls, minotaurs, I even saw some dark dwarves in the mix. No greater gazers? Not that I saw, Kaiden replied. It seemed that the gazers thought they still had everything under control. He supposed that they did, from their point of view. The 3 directors, 6 standards and their escort were more than enough to deal with their white problem. Did you assign anyone to keep an eye on them? From a distance. We won't get to hear their mad ramblings, unfortunately. I'm sure we'll hear plenty of that when we start stabbing them. He couldn't wait to go on the offensive. After the siege of Feelhammer, he had more than his fill of slow attrition battles. He wasn't even fighting in the current one. As they waited for reports from the front, a dozen elder liches joined them at the command post. What are you lot doing here? Aldan frowned. We are here under orders from the Citadel, one of them replied. Prince Feelhammer has instructed us to conduct a probing attack against Grimmantle at your discretion. What sort of reaction is he looking for? Aldan asked. A defensive one, the Elder Lich answered. Were the gazers already running out of battle fodder to throw at them? He supposed that was what the Elder Liches were there to find out. If the gazers ceased their offensive the moment the Elder Liches attacked Grimmantle, there was a good chance that their forces were depleted to the point that they were feeling vulnerable. But first, we should get rid of those reinforcements. That's an ambitious look you have there, brother. How large do you think this gazer hive is? Pretty damn big, his sister replied, considering the army that the council threw at us. We have the opportunity to take out 3 directors and 6 standards on our terms, Uldan said. It's better than sending the Elder Liches over right away and having the gazers retreat. You're the commander, she shrugged. I'm just here to help spread food and happiness. Uldan stroked his beard thoughtfully as he examined the streets below. He was confident that he could see the gazers destroyed, but pulling things off cleanly was another question. He called together his officers and the nearby Elder Lich sergeants. The gazers have teleported in their first real force, he told them. 3 directors and 6 standards, plus elite slaves. It shouldn't take them long to get through the loose whites. We'll be preparing a welcome for them at the intersection below us. How do we get them here without turning into piles of dust? One of his officers asked. We'll have to blend our dominated whites in with the uncontrolled ones and have the gazers clear their way up to us, Uldan answered. While they do that, have the Death Knights collect as many cargo bins and doors as they can and scatter them around the intersection. Deeping Stone, find the Death Warriors some sniping positions in the buildings nearby, get your free deep wardens up there, too. What is the reasoning behind these precautions? An Elder Lich sergeant asked. Long-range gazer ray powers are all ray attacks, Uldan answered. You don't want to be caught out in the open against one. Also, your forces will probably be useless at close ranges unless they can somehow get behind their target. Our melee infantry will merely serve as a distraction while the ranged attackers take them down. This is assuming that they are what we think they are, of course. One of the Elder Liches from the Citadel raised a bony hand. Are we participating in this venture? Not unless I call for it, Uldan told it. You're supposed to be using your mana for something else. The undead and his officers dispersed to carry out his orders. Without anyone else to smile at, the human came over to smile at him. I hope you don't mind me watching the battle from here, she said. Since you're supposedly invincible, Uldan replied, you can go wherever you want. I'm not invincible. Is that something you're supposed to tell other people? The fact that she was impervious to attacks of all sorts, from poison to crossbow bolts to the heart, had made the rounds, serving to reinforce the rumors surrounding her. Those rumors, in turn, served as a deterrent against additional assassination attempts by whatever was left of the Council's infiltrators in Harda. In that case, Uldan said, you can go wherever you want, but you do so at your own risk. For the sake of my sanity, Velgarth grumbled, let's just stay put. In response, the human pulled a whole damn desk out of her bag and set out 2 chairs. She produced some sketchy-looking food and offered some to Velgarth, who looked even more miserable than before. A few minutes later, Kaiden came down the stairs from the rooftop. The gazers are on the move, sir, she said. How are they deploying? Uldan asked. They're still teleporting in reinforcements. Everything's mostly going as it has for the last couple of days except for the fact that they have those heavy hitters with them now. Well, it's not as if it was a bad strategy in the first place. As he understood it, using amassed battle fodder was commonly accepted as the optimal opening battle strategy for any civilized society. There was little point in investing too much in low-rung soldiers whose main purpose was to deplete the resources of the opposing side. The gazers took this to the extreme as they didn't even care about battlefield coordination, they just pushed their slaves in the general direction of their enemies. Which way are they headed? Clearing the areas closest to their landing zone, for now, Kaiden said. The gazers should see our whites coming. Not long after they arrived, the directors had the watchers stop trying to stop the loose whites. They're arranged in a reconnaissance array over the area now. Can we disrupt it? We tried, Kaiden replied. After losing 100 or 200 of the things, the directors had them observed from a higher altitude. Leaving the street lamps on is working against us in this case. Uldan briefly pondered using summoned wraiths to get the job done, but he ultimately decided against it. For the time being, he wanted the gazers to advance with confidence.
Will their scouts notice the ambush being set up? He asked. They won't see the undead in the buildings, Kaiden answered, but they'll notice the ones in the streets if they do something that makes them stand out too much. My suggestion would be to keep the Death Knights in the shadows of the alleys until we're ready to trap the gazers. The Whites can stay out there since that's what the gazers are expecting. He nodded at the Elder Lich Sergeant that had remained at the command post for communications purposes. The undead mage raised a hand to its skull. Corrections to our positioning have been issued, it said a few seconds later, but it is unknown whether our forces have been detected. Noticing that something's off is a far cry from knowing what exactly it is, Kaiden said. Death Knights don't look too different from Whites when you're looking down from high above. We just needed to move them before the gazers' main force wanted a closer look at what's ahead of them. Several more scouts came in over the next hour, reporting the methodical advance of the directors and their escort. As expected, the 100,000 or so loose Whites scattered within the perimeter were absolutely no match for them. Contact the other defense commanders in the area, Aldan said. If the directors get within 2 blocks of the perimeter, our forces need to back off. We need those things to latch onto our Whites. What will you do if the gazers break through the wrong side of the perimeter? Velgarth asked. Swear a lot, Aldan answered. Our only choice would be to chase after them. Most of the least undead forces in the area had been consolidated to conduct their ambush. The other commanders could probably still slow the gazers down to the point that they wouldn't get far before the undead caught up to them, but it would still be a mess. Back away from the windows, a deep warden called. They're nearly here. Aldan retreated further into the room, as did everyone else aside from the deep warden sentries who remained concealed at their posts. Though their enemy was close, he could barely detect the clash of battle. Do you have dominated forces down there? Aldan asked the Elder Lich Sergeant. Yes. How far from the intersection are they? Their slave vanguard is roughly 100 meters distant, coming directly up the street from block before. So close I could see them if we could look down out of the windows. Of course, they would see him too and that would be the end of him. How are they conducting their offense? He asked. Their slaves appear to be doing most of the work, the Elder Lich answered. They are destroying the Whites one group at a time. I'm surprised you didn't send them all at once, Aldan said. Our forces have been in situations where the emulation of disorganized behavior was required. We deemed that the current strategy warranted similar behavior. If the undead weren't on their side, the Elder Lich's statement would have been a cause for grave concern. Aldan wondered how far removed these undead were from their regular counterparts in terms of their behavior and thinking. 80 meters from the intersection, one of the Deep Wardens said in a low voice. There are upwards of 5,000 slaves with them. I've never seen a few of those races before. What about their individual combat strength? It's too far to tell directly, but they're swatting Whites aside like vermin. Can you see their masters yet? They're just coming into view, the Deep Warden replied. Hemispherical formation at the rear of the slaves with a tight shell of watchers covering them. They'll be onto any ambush as soon as it starts. Aldan envisioned the intersection below. With the gazer formation as it was, he would have to let the bulk of their forces pass before springing his trap. No, that's far too risky. All those slaves have to do is poke their heads into the nearest alley. It was a miracle that they hadn't already. That, or the Elder Liches were pulling off some sort of tactical wizardry with their diversionary assets. We're going to have to alter the plan a bit, Aldan said. Pull the Death Knights further into the alleys and draw those slaves in with Whites. Start getting to work trimming down the gazer forces, but leave the undead inside the buildings on standby. Understood. He winced slightly as a set of unearthly howls rose from the darkness between the buildings nearby. Guttural cries issued in response and the din of battle rose sharply in volume. What are the gazers doing? He asked. The directors stopped about 40 meters from the intersection, a Deep Warden answered. I can't hear what they're saying, but more slaves are rushing forward. Move to seal off the street behind them. A watcher floated down to window level. 2 of its eye stalks turned to look at them. Take that thing out. The nearest Deep Warden leveled his arbalest and buried a quarrel in the watcher's body through its central eye. The tan-fleshed aberration wobbled in the air for a second before dropping out of sight. At the same time, a beam of light lanced up from the street and struck the Deep Warden. The Deep Warden snarled as his flesh was transmuted into stone,
leaving him as a lifelike dwarf statue staring out of the window. "Start working on those directors," Aldan ordered. "Use whatever you can to keep them distracted." 3 more watchers floated down to look into the windows. The deep wardens around the room took several steps deeper into the room before dispatching the flying scouts. Their position was good as revealed, but, hopefully, it also meant that the gazers were focused on them instead of the undead sent against them. 20% of the enemy forces have been destroyed, the Elder Lich Sergeant said. Progress can no longer be made without advancing from the alleys. Have the directors been cut off? As well as can be managed, the Elder Lich replied. The number of available obstacles is diminishing rapidly. Press the attack from our side, Aldan said. There's no need for this deception any longer. He waited for the sounds of battle to drift away from the window before crawling over. Are they paying any attention to our position anymore? Aldan asked. I don't think so, Kaidin replied. Most of them are facing away towards the undead behind them. They're recalling their slaves to cover their asses, as well. Aldan cautiously poked his head above the bottom edge of the window. Just past the intersection, the gazer formation had tightened up to defend against the oncoming undead. Rays of light seared through the darkness in nearly every direction as the invaders suddenly found themselves beset on all sides by far more than they had bargained for. The Death Warriors are having trouble landing ranged attacks against their targets, the Elder Lich said. It's the directors, Aldan said. Their central eye produces a deflection field. There's no easy way to crack open their defenses. As he spoke, a quarrel from one of the buildings above the intersection bounced off of the hemispherical shield covering a director. While the director's central eye focused on defense, its 10 eye stalks continued moving around, attacking every potential threat around it. We need more pressure, Aldan said. Use every white we have at our disposal. Pale green figures emerged from the buildings, swarming out of the windows and the doors. The director's escort held them at bay, but the momentum of so many bodies still crowded them into an ever-tightening space. One of the troll slaves bumped into a standard, who responded by biting the troll in half and hurling it a dozen meters away using its mouth. A bead of flame streaked down from one of the windows, blossoming into a fireball that burnt a hole into the gazer's slave formation. A dozen watchers were destroyed as well, but the standards and directors exposed to the blast showed no signs of damage on their stony hides. Several more fireballs streaked in from the same direction. This time, however, they simply winked out of existence before reaching their target. Attacking them from the front with spells is bound to fail, Aldan told the Elder Lich Sergeant. You have to coordinate attacks from both sides at once. A few seconds later, a pair of fireballs did just that, blasting open another hole in the slave formation. More pairs of fireballs came streaking in and the gazers tightened their formation again for better coverage. This did not, however, save the slave escort from quickly being stripped away. Watchers flew in from above to fill the gaps in the director's defenses. Kaidin, Aldan called out. The scouts should be free to act now. Get them on those gazers. On it, she said. Steel quarrels hailed down on the directors and their escort. The martial art-imbued attacks punched through the gazers' defenses and buried themselves in the floating orbs by the dozen. Rays of light continued to lance out from the eyes of the beleaguered gazers, but the haphazard attacks only served to illustrate their growing desperation. Still, the attacks were undoubtedly lethal. A brilliant green light from one of the standards struck a Death Knight who had lost the last bit of its cover, turning it into a pile of dust. Suddenly, one of them collapsed onto the street, leaking green viscera. Feelhammer's defenders wasted no time exploiting the opening and the other 8 gazers swiftly joined the first. Aldan let out a quiet breath into the eerie silence that followed. He rose to his full height and made his way down to the street to survey the aftermath. If this single battle was a mere taste of what awaited them in the rest of Khazanah, a hard war lay ahead of them, even with the least undead.